The wealthy man's face turned pale as he froze mid-sentence. The sneer on his lips wiped away like a bad dream. His piercing blue eyes were locked on a tall, broad-shouldered black man walking confidently toward him. The man, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit and polished shoes, radiated authority. For the first time that evening, the wealthy man's arrogance wavered, replaced by a visible sense of discomfort. The man in the suit stopped just short of the table, his calm gaze shifting between the wealthy man and the waiter who stood trembling, still clutching an empty tray. With a low, firm voice, the suited man addressed the wealthy patron. "Is there a problem here?" The wealthy man swallowed hard, his confidence shaken. He couldn't find the words to respond, but his eyes darted to the waiter, then back to the suited man. It was clear he recognized him. The suited man took a slow step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm asking," he said, "because it's not every day a customer walks into my restaurant and thinks they can humiliate my staff without consequences." The wealthy man's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands fidgeted with the silk napkin on the table. The other patrons nearby had gone silent, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. The waiter's wide eyes flickered to the suited man, then back to the wealthy customer. The tension in the room was electric. 3 hours earlier, it was a busy Friday evening at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan. Tables filled with well-dressed diners clinking wine glasses, murmured conversations weaving together to form a pleasant hum. At one of the corner tables, David Thornton, a millionaire in his mid-50s, lounged in a tailored charcoal gray suit. He was the picture of wealth and privilege, with slicked-back silver hair and a Rolex glinting on his wrist. David wasn't dining alone. He was entertaining a small group of business partners, all eager to stay in his good graces. The meal had been perfect so far, but David enjoyed finding small imperfections to complain about. It made him feel important. Their table was being attended by James, a young black waiter in his early 20s. Polite and soft-spoken, James was efficient and professional despite David's increasingly condescending remarks. David made a show of inspecting the menu, his voice dripping with disdain. "Is this the best wine you have? I thought this was supposed to be a 5-star establishment." He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming. James smiled politely, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped his pen. "I can bring you our reserve list, sir," he said. "Do that," David said sharply. "And don't take forever. Some of us have lives to get back to." The others at the table chuckled nervously. They weren't sure if David was joking or being rude, but they didn't want to risk offending him. James returned moments later with the reserve wine list. As he handed it to David, the millionaire made no effort to hide his annoyance. "What took you so long? It's not rocket science, is it?" James bit the inside of his cheek. "I apologize for the delay, sir. If you'd like, I can." David waved him off. "Save it. Just make sure our food gets here faster than the wine." The night wore on, and David continued to find fault with everything. The bread wasn't warm enough, the butter too soft, the salad underdressed. Each time James approached the table, David greeted him with a fresh insult. "Do you even know what you're doing?" David barked when James accidentally bumped his chair while setting down a plate. "Or did they just pull you off the street and hand you an apron?" The comment hung in the air, louder than the clinking silverware or whispered conversations around them. James froze, his face flushing with embarrassment. He took a step back, muttering an apology, but David wasn't finished. "You should be thanking me for letting you serve me," David added, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you have any idea how lucky you are to even be here? People like you don't belong in places like this." A hush fell over the nearby tables. James stood frozen, gripping the edge of his tray. His chest tightened, but he refused to look away. Years of dealing with difficult customers had taught him to stay composed, but this was different. As the tension reached its peak, a tall, sharply dressed man emerged from the back of the restaurant, his gaze locking on the commotion at David's table. It was Miles Carter, the owner of the restaurant, a former lawyer turned entrepreneur who had built the establishment from the ground up. Miles walked toward the table with a purposeful stride, his presence commanding attention. He didn't need to raise his voice to make everyone in the room feel the weight of his authority. When he arrived at the table, Miles looked at James first, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. James nodded, though his voice wavered as he said, "Yes, sir." Miles turned his attention to David, who had gone from smug to visibly uncomfortable in a matter of seconds. And that's when it happened. The moment David's arrogance evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable look of recognition. Miles wasn't just the owner of the restaurant. He was a man David had encountered before, in circumstances that would soon come to light. Miles's calm yet pointed question hung in the air. "Is there a problem here?" David hesitated, his usually confident demeanor slipping as his eyes flicked around the room. He seemed to weigh his next words carefully, aware that everyone was waiting for his response. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, Miles raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "I'm not here to listen to excuses," Miles said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure my staff are treated with the respect they deserve. You have two options. You apologize to my waiter, or you leave." Right now, the air grew heavy with anticipation. David's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but Miles didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on the millionaire, daring him to make his choice. And just like that, the chapter ended with a sense of unresolved tension, leaving everyone, both in the restaurant and in the story, on the edge of their seats. David's hand trembled slightly as he set down his wine glass. He glanced at the other men at his table, hoping for some backup, but none of them met his gaze. They were just as stunned as he was. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery from diners too polite to stare openly. "I don't see why I should apologize," David said finally, his voice laced with indignation. "I'm the customer here. If anyone should be apologizing, it's him." For the poor service, Miles's eyes narrowed. He took a deliberate step forward, placing himself between David and James. His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was an edge to his tone now. "Let me be very clear. I don't care how much money you have or how important you think you are. In my restaurant, we treat people with dignity. If you can't do that, you're not welcome here." David's jaw tightened. He was used to getting his way, and this kind of public reprimand was a rare humiliation. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he snapped, leaning forward as if to intimidate. Miles didn't budge. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thornton. Do you know who I am?" The question landed like a thunderclap. David blinked, thrown off balance. He studied Miles's face more closely, and then it hit him. His eyes widened, the color draining from his cheeks. "You," David stammered, pointing a shaky finger. "You're—" "That's right," Miles interrupted. His voice was low, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "I'm the man who owns this restaurant. And I'm also the same Miles Carter you turned down for funding 8 years ago because, as you so eloquently put it, people like me aren't worth investing in." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Whispers followed, diners craning their necks to see what would happen next. David's face twisted in shock. "It was just business," he sputtered. "Nothing personal." Miles's eyes burned with quiet intensity. "It's always just business for men like you, isn't it? But let me tell you what happened after you dismissed me that day. I found someone who believed in my vision, someone who didn't care about the color of my skin. And now, I own one of the most successful restaurants in the city. So, Mr. Thornton, forgive me if I don't roll out the red carpet for you." David's arrogance faltered completely. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His business partners squirmed uncomfortably, clearly wishing they were anywhere but at that table. Miles turned to James, his expression softening. "James, thank you for your professionalism tonight. Why don't you take a break? I'll handle this table." James hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He left quickly, relief evident in his posture. Miles faced David again, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to apologize, or you're going to leave. It's that simple." David sat frozen, torn between his pride and the overwhelming pressure of the situation. The room was still, every eye on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David muttered, "I'm sorry." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Louder, so everyone can hear it." David's face turned crimson. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time louder. Satisfied, Miles stepped back. Good. Now finish your meal without any more incidents, or I'll personally escort you out. The tension in the room eased as Miles walked away, but the atmosphere at David's table remained icy. He refused to make eye contact with his companions, who were clearly embarrassed by the ordeal. David's mind churned with resentment. He wasn't used to being put in his place, and the humiliation burned like a brand. But he wasn't done yet. No one embarrassed David Thornton without facing consequences. After the meal, as his group prepared to leave, David lingered near the entrance, pretending to wait for his coat. In reality, he was watching Miles, who stood near the bar, speaking to the head chef. David's lips curled into a tight smile as an idea formed in his mind. He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. If Miles Carter thought he could humiliate him in public, he was about to learn a hard lesson about power. The next morning, the restaurant's phones wouldn't stop ringing. Miles arrived early, as he always did, to find the staff in a panic. The hostess, her face pale, rushed up to him. "Mr. Carter, there's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet, her hands shaking. On the screen was a viral social media post, an edited video of the previous night's confrontation. The caption read, "Restaurant owner bullies customer over honest feedback." The post had already racked up thousands of views and comments, with people taking sides. Many seemed to believe David's twisted version of the story, painting him as the victim of an overzealous restaurant owner. Miles's jaw clenched as he read through the comments, his heart sinking. This wasn't just an attack on his reputation. It was an attack on everything he'd worked so hard to build. And as he scrolled further, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The restaurant staff exchanged worried glances as they gathered around Miles, waiting for him to say something. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by a tense silence as he handed the tablet back to the hostess. "Get me James," Miles said quietly, his tone steady but laced with urgency. Moments later, James appeared, looking nervous. "Mr. Carter, I heard about the video," he said. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Miles held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't your fault," he said firmly. "But we need to figure out who recorded this and why." James nodded, relief washing over his face. "I think one of the men at the table might have done it. I noticed him holding his phone up a few times, but I didn't think much of it." Miles exhaled sharply. That makes sense. David Thornton wasn't going to let this go quietly. Just as he was about to formulate a plan, the restaurant phone rang again. The hostess hesitated, then answered. Her expression shifted as she listened, her cheeks flushing with anger. She handed the phone to Miles. "It's a reporter from the Times. They're asking for a comment about the video." Miles took the phone, his mind racing. He wasn't about to let David control the narrative. But before he could speak, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A black car idling across the street, its windows tinted. Miles's eyes narrowed. He had a gut feeling this wasn't just about a video anymore. As he placed the phone to his ear, he couldn't shake the sense that David Thornton wasn't done causing trouble. And he was right. Something much bigger was coming. Miles kept his tone calm and measured as he spoke to the reporter, though his mind was already plotting his next move. "This video is an incomplete portrayal of what happened. I'm happy to provide the full context, but I'll also say this. Our staff are treated with respect, and I stand by my actions to ensure that remains true in my restaurant." The reporter pressed for more details, but Miles ended the call swiftly. He wasn't about to let himself get cornered by a media frenzy. Handing the phone back to the hostess, he turned to the team. "Everyone, listen up," he began, his voice firm but reassuring. "We're going to get through this. First, I need you all to focus on your work and ignore the noise online. Second, we'll issue an official statement with our security footage to set the record straight." The staff nodded, their nerves visibly easing under Miles's confident leadership. But Miles knew better than to think this would be the end of it. David Thornton was a man who thrived on power plays, and Miles wasn't naive enough to think this was the last he'd hear from him. By noon, the restaurant's social media accounts were flooded with comments, some supportive, others scathing. Miles's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, many from reporters and a few from friends warning him about the backlash. Meanwhile, across town, David Thornton sat in his plush office, watching the chaos unfold with a satisfied smirk. He sipped his scotch, his gaze fixed on his laptop screen where a news segment played. The headline read, "Restaurant Feud Sparks Controversy Over Customer Service Standards." "This is only the beginning," David muttered to himself, dialing his assistant. "Get me a PR firm. I want to escalate this." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, do you think that's necessary? The video's already gaining traction." David cut her off. "I don't pay you to second-guess me. Just do it." Back at the restaurant, Miles was reviewing the security footage with his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Clara. They had pulled the video from several angles, showing David's behavior throughout the evening. "This is damning," Clara said, shaking her head. "It clearly shows him insulting James and trying to provoke you. But the problem is public perception. That edited video went viral first, so people have already made up their minds." Miles leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "So what do we do? Release this footage and hope people bother to watch it?" Clara gave him a pointed look. "We don't just release it. We frame it. Show the world who David Thornton really is. Dig into his background if we have to. There's no way this guy doesn't have skeletons in his closet." Miles frowned. "I don't want to stoop to his level." "This isn't about stooping," Clara said firmly. "It's about protecting your business and your reputation. Thornton's playing dirty, and if you don't push back, he'll bury you." Miles nodded reluctantly. "Do it. Start digging. And make sure James is protected in all of this. He doesn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire." As Clara left to begin her investigation, Miles stepped into the kitchen to check on his staff. He found James near the prep station, helping with an influx of orders. "James," Miles called out, motioning for him to step aside. James wiped his hands on his apron and approached, looking wary. "Is everything okay, Mr. Carter?" Miles offered a small smile. "It will be. I just wanted to let you know that you're not alone in this. Whatever happens, I'll make sure you're taken care of." James nodded, though his shoulders were still tense. "Thank you. I hate that all of this is happening because of me." "It's not because of you," Miles said firmly. "It's because of people like David Thornton who think they can treat others however they want. And we're going to show him that's not how the world works anymore." James nodded again, this time with a spark of determination in his eyes. As the afternoon wore on, Miles kept an eye on his phone, waiting for updates from Clara. When her call finally came, it wasn't good news. "Thornton's already hired a PR firm," Clara said. "They've put out a statement claiming you targeted him because he gave your restaurant a bad review. He's painting himself as the victim, and the media's eating it up." Miles clenched his jaw. "What about his background? Did you find anything?" There was a pause on the line. Then Clara said, "Yeah, and you're not going to believe this." Miles's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Clara's voice dropped to a near whisper. "David Thornton has ties to a political donor who's been funding campaigns to dismantle civil rights protections. If we play this right, we could expose him for who he really is. But it's risky. You'd be putting a target on your back." Miles exhaled, his mind racing. This was bigger than he'd expected, and the stakes had just been raised. "Send me everything you've got," he said. "If Thornton wants a fight, he's going to get one." As he hung up the phone, the door to the restaurant burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, flanked by two others who looked like security. "Mr. Carter?" the man called out, his tone cold. Miles stepped forward, his expression calm but guarded. "That's me. Can I help you?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Miles. "You've been served." Miles opened the envelope, his stomach tightening as he read the contents. David Thornton had just filed a lawsuit against him for defamation. The staff looked on in stunned silence as Miles folded the papers and tucked them under his arm. He straightened his shoulders, his mind already turning over his next move. He wasn't going to let Thornton win. Not this time. Miles closed the restaurant early that evening, gathering his staff in the main dining room. The lawsuit was a new complication, but it wasn't going to derail everything he'd built. As the team murmured anxiously among themselves, Miles stood at the front of the room, commanding their attention. "Let me start by saying this. I will fight this," he began, his voice steady. Thornton thinks he can scare us into backing down, but he underestimated who he's dealing with. None of you are at risk. I'll handle this, but I need your support to keep this place running smoothly. Can I count on you?" The staff exchanged glances, then nodded. James, standing near the back, was the first to speak. "You've always had our backs, Mr. Carter. We've got yours too." A ripple of agreement passed through the group, and Miles felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just a business to him, it was a family. After dismissing the staff, Miles returned to his office and called Clara. "I've been served," he said, handing her the details of the lawsuit via email. "I saw it coming," Clara replied grimly. "Thornton's playing this perfectly. By suing you for defamation, he's forcing you to go on the defensive. It's a tactic to shift the focus off his behavior and onto you." Miles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What's the next move?" "We counter," Clara said. "We file a motion to dismiss based on the truth. The footage shows he acted inappropriately, which justifies your actions. But this is going to be a long fight, Miles. Are you ready for that?" Miles nodded. "I don't have a choice. If I let him win, it sets a precedent for people like him to do whatever they want without consequences." Clara's voice softened. "You're doing the right thing. But be careful. Men like Thornton don't play fair." Miles hung up, his resolve hardening. He spent the next few hours reviewing the evidence with Clara, planning their strategy. By the time he left the restaurant, it was late, and the streets of Manhattan were quiet. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the sidewalk behind him was empty. Shaking off the unease, he climbed into his car and started the engine. Halfway home, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Miles's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His instincts told him Thornton was behind the threat, but he had no proof. The next day, Miles arrived at the restaurant to find Clara waiting for him, holding a stack of papers. Her expression was grim. "You're not going to like this," she said, handing him the documents. Miles scanned them quickly, his stomach sinking. Thornton's team had filed a motion for an injunction, attempting to freeze the restaurant's assets until the lawsuit was resolved. "This would cripple us," Miles said, his voice low. "If they block our accounts, we can't pay staff or vendors." Clara nodded. "That's the point. He's trying to squeeze you financially, hoping you'll settle to make this go away." Miles set the papers down, his jaw tight. "What are our chances of fighting this?" Clara hesitated. "It's not impossible, but it'll depend on how the judge views the case. We need to prove Thornton's claims are baseless." Miles exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "Then we'll do just that. Thornton wants a war. He's got one." Later that day, as Miles worked with Clara to prepare their case, a sudden commotion erupted in the dining room. He rushed out to find James standing near the front door, visibly shaken. "What's going on?" Miles asked. James pointed to a shattered window near the entrance, where a brick lay on the floor. Attached to it was a note scrawled in red marker. "Close your doors before we make you." The staff gathered around, murmuring in fear. Miles bent down to pick up the brick, his expression grim. "This isn't just about Thornton anymore," he said. "Someone else is getting involved." James stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Do you think it's, because of me?" Miles shook his head. "This isn't your fault, James. Whoever's behind this wants to intimidate us, but we're not going to let them win." He turned to the staff. "Everyone, take the rest of the day off. I'll call the police and get this handled." As the staff dispersed, Miles stared at the brick in his hand, his mind spinning. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was personal. That evening, Miles met with Clara and a private investigator he'd hired to look into Thornton's background. The investigator, a grizzled man named Dan, placed a thick file on the table. "I dug deep," Dan said, lighting a cigarette. "Thornton's got connections to some shady characters. Corporate lobbyists, political donors, even a few names linked to organized crime." Miles's eyes widened. "Organized crime?" Dan nodded. "Yeah, nothing concrete, but there's enough smoke to suggest fire. If he's using those connections to intimidate you, we need to be careful." Clara frowned. "This changes things. If Thornton's pulling strings with people like that, this could get dangerous. Miles leaned forward, his expression hard. Let's expose him. The public deserves to know who they're dealing with. Dan raised an eyebrow. You sure? Once this goes public, there's no going back. Thornton won't just come after your business. He'll come after you. Miles hesitated, then nodded. I'm sure. Thornton crossed a line, and I'm not backing down. As they finalized their plan, Miles's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. Last warning. Miles stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. Whatever Thornton had planned next, he would be ready. The air was thick with tension the next morning as Miles walked into the restaurant. He could feel the weight of the threats and the lawsuit pressing on his shoulders, but he refused to let it show. His team was counting on him, and he wasn't about to let Thornton or anyone else tear down what they had built. As Miles reached his office, Clara was already there, her laptop open and files spread across the desk. Morning, she said without looking up. We've got work to do. The injunction hearing is set for tomorrow. Miles nodded, hanging his coat. Good. What's the plan? We'll argue that the injunction is a retaliatory move designed to harm your business, Clara said. The footage of Thornton's behavior strengthens our case, but we'll need more than that to sway the judge. Have you thought about releasing the security video to the public? Miles hesitated. If we release it, it could help clear our name. But Thornton will twist it, just like he did with the first video. Clara leaned forward. Then we need to get ahead of him. If we release it with a statement addressing the threats, the lawsuit, and his connections, we control the narrative. Miles took a deep breath. Let's do it. The truth needs to come out. Clara nodded, immediately drafting a press release. Meanwhile, Miles called Dan, the private investigator, to see if there were any updates on Thornton's connections. Got something interesting, Dan said. Thornton's been using a shell company to make payments to a lobbying firm tied to anti-labor legislation. If we dig deeper, we might find a direct link to the threats you've been receiving. Miles's stomach churned. What's the timeline on this? A few days, maybe less, Dan replied. But if we find something solid, it'll blow his case out of the water. Do it, Miles said. And be careful. Later that afternoon, Miles stepped out of his office to check on the team. James was at his station, quieter than usual but determined. As Miles approached, James looked up and offered a small smile. Thanks for sticking up for me, Mr. Carter, James said. I know all this is because Thornton doesn't like being told he's wrong. It's not just about you, Miles replied. Thornton's the kind of man who thinks he can step on anyone who doesn't fit his idea of what's acceptable. People like that need to be stopped. James nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. You're already helping, Miles said. By showing up, by doing your job, you're proving him wrong. That evening, Miles and Clara finalized the press release and uploaded the security footage to the restaurant's social media accounts. The accompanying statement was direct and unapologetic. At Carter's, we pride ourselves on treating everyone with dignity and respect. Recent events have brought to light the behavior of a customer who chose to demean one of our employees, and we have taken a stand to protect our team. The attached video speaks for itself. We have also reported threats made against our business to the authorities. We will not be intimidated. Within hours, the post went viral. Comments poured in, many of them supportive, though some questioned Miles's decision to escalate the situation. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a self-made entrepreneur and a powerful businessman. Miles was scrolling through the responses when his phone buzzed. It was Dan. You're not going to believe this, Dan said. I traced one of the numbers tied to the threats you've been getting. It belongs to a burner phone registered to one of Thornton's associates. Miles's heart sank. Do you have proof? Enough to make it worth reporting, Dan said. But be careful. If Thornton realizes we're onto him, he might escalate. The next day, as Miles prepared for the injunction hearing, a group of protesters gathered outside the restaurant. Some carried signs in support of Miles and his staff, while others held signs accusing him of unfairly targeting Thornton. The media swarmed the scene, cameras flashing as Miles stepped out to address the crowd. Carter's has always been a place where people are treated fairly, no matter who they are, Miles said, his voice steady. We won't let intimidation or lies destroy what we've built. The truth is on our side. Inside the courthouse, the hearing was tense. Thornton's lawyers argued that the injunction was necessary to prevent further harm to his reputation, painting him as the victim of a malicious campaign. Clara countered with the security footage and evidence of Thornton's behavior, emphasizing the retaliatory nature of the lawsuit. As the judge reviewed the evidence, Thornton sat smugly at his table, confident he would win. Miles glanced at him, wondering if the man felt any remorse for the chaos he had caused. The judge finally spoke. After reviewing the evidence presented, I find that the plaintiff's request for an injunction is without merit. The motion is denied. Thornton's face darkened, his smugness replaced with fury. Clara smiled triumphantly, whispering, "Round one goes to us." But as they left the courthouse, Miles's phone buzzed with another unknown text. "You think this is over? It's just getting started." Miles looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Thornton's associates. He could feel the storm brewing, and this time, it wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for survival. Miles stared at his phone, the ominous text still on the screen. The courthouse crowd swirled around him. Reporters firing off questions, supporters cheering, detractors shouting. But he was no longer listening. The words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. "It's just getting started." Clara touched his arm, snapping him back to the moment. "You okay?" Miles nodded, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Yeah. Let's get out of here." They pushed through the throng and headed toward Clara's car. Once inside, Clara turned to him. "That text, was it another threat?" Miles hesitated. "Yeah. It feels personal. Thornton doesn't just want to win. He wants to destroy me." Clara frowned. "We've got enough to report him to the police." Between the burner phone and these messages, it's obvious he's escalating. But we need to be smart. Thornton's powerful, and if he's got ties to dangerous people, this could get ugly fast. Miles leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly. "Report it. Let's make sure the authorities know exactly who we're dealing with." Back at the restaurant, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The news of the injunction being denied had spread quickly, and the staff felt a renewed sense of hope. James approached Miles as he entered the dining room. "Mr. Carter, I heard what happened in court," James said. "That's a big win, right?" "It's a step in the right direction," Miles replied, though his expression remained serious. "But Thornton's not done. We need to stay vigilant." James nodded. "Whatever happens, we've got your back." Miles smiled faintly. "Thanks, James. That means a lot." That evening, Miles met with Clara and Dan to review their next steps. Dan had uncovered more damning information about Thornton's connections, including payments made to a security firm with ties to organized crime. "If we release this, it'll destroy his reputation," Dan said. "But it'll also put a target on your back, Miles. Thornton's not the kind of guy to take this lying down." Miles considered the risk. Every instinct told him to fight, but he couldn't ignore the potential danger to himself, his staff, and the business. "Let's hold on to it for now," Miles said finally. "We'll use it if he pushes us further. For now, I want to focus on building support for the restaurant. If we show the public who we really are, it'll be harder for Thornton to paint us as the villains." Clara nodded. "That's a smart move. I'll draft a campaign highlighting the staff and the values that make this place special. If Thornton wants to drag us through the mud, we'll rise above it." The next few days were a whirlwind. Clara's campaign gained traction, with customers and supporters sharing stories of their positive experiences at Carter's. The restaurant saw a surge in reservations, and the staff felt a renewed sense of pride. But the peace didn't last. Late one night, Miles was locking up the restaurant when he noticed a shadowy figure lingering across the street. The man was tall and stocky, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. As Miles stepped outside, the man lit a cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating his features. Miles's pulse quickened. He couldn't place the man, but the way he was watching the restaurant sent a chill down his spine. "Can I help you?" Miles called out, his voice firm. The man didn't respond. He took a long drag from his cigarette, then flicked the butt onto the sidewalk and walked away. Miles watched him disappear into the night, his unease growing. The next morning, Miles arrived at the restaurant to find the front window shattered again. This time, the message was spray-painted across the door in bold red letters. "You've been warned." The staff gathered outside, murmuring in fear as Miles inspected the damage. His jaw tightened, and he turned to Clara, who had just arrived. "This is Thornton," Miles said. "He's trying to intimidate us." Clara nodded grimly. "We need to call the police. This has gone too far." Miles agreed, and within an hour, officers were on the scene, taking statements and collecting evidence. But Miles could tell they weren't optimistic about finding the culprits. As the officers left, Miles gathered the staff inside. "I know this is scary," he said, "but we're not backing down. Thornton wants us to fold, but we're going to show him that we're stronger than that." James stepped forward. "What if he doesn't stop? What if someone gets hurt?" Miles met his gaze, his expression serious. "If it comes to that, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you all safe. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I trust you." That evening, as Miles was reviewing the day's events with Clara, Dan called with urgent news. "I just found something big," Dan said. "Thornton's been moving money through offshore accounts tied to that security firm. It looks like he's funding some kind of operation. I don't know what, but it's shady as hell." Miles's grip tightened on the phone. Could it be connected to the threats? "Could be," Dan said. "But if we expose this, Thornton won't just be dealing with a PR disaster. He'll be facing federal charges. The question is, are you ready to pull the trigger?" Miles's heart pounded as he considered the implications. Exposing Thornton would be the ultimate blow, but it would also escalate the conflict to dangerous levels. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Last chance to walk away. Miles's jaw clenched. He wasn't walking away. "Do it," he said into the phone. "Expose everything." Dan hesitated. "You sure? Once this goes live, there's no going back." Miles's voice was firm. "I'm sure. Thornton needs to be stopped." As he hung up, Miles knew the next move would change everything. The battle was about to reach a boiling point, and there was no telling how far Thornton would go to protect himself. The fallout began almost immediately after Dan released the evidence. Within hours, the internet exploded with headlines detailing Thornton's offshore accounts, ties to organized crime, and questionable business dealings. Prominent businessman linked to shady operations? David Thornton's empire built on corruption? News anchors dissected the revelations, pointing out the hypocrisy of Thornton's public image as a self-made millionaire. The allegations spread like wildfire, drawing scrutiny not just from the media but also from law enforcement. Miles watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The truth was out, but he knew Thornton wouldn't go down quietly. Thornton sat in his sprawling penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand as he stared at the television. Every channel covered the scandal, his name plastered across the screen. His jaw tightened with every word, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the glass. How the hell did they find this? Thornton snapped, slamming the glass down on the table. His assistant, standing nervously nearby, stammered, It must have been Carter. He's the only one who has a reason to dig this deep." Thornton's lips curled into a snarl. "Carter? That damn restaurant owner thinks he can take me down?" He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Call our people. I want this handled. No loose ends." The assistant hesitated. "What do you mean by handled?" Thornton shot him a sharp look. "I mean Carter needs to be dealt with. And I don't care how it's done." Back at the restaurant, Miles was addressing his staff. The atmosphere was tense after the second vandalism incident, but the team rallied behind him, determined to keep the business running despite the threats. "I know things feel uncertain right now," Miles said, his voice steady. "But we've come too far to let someone like Thornton scare us into giving up. He's on the ropes now, and he knows it. That's why he's lashing out. Stay strong and we'll get through this." James raised his hand. What if he does more than just threats? What if he actually tries something? Miles paused, the weight of the question sinking in. "If it comes to that, we'll handle it. I've already contacted the police, and we're stepping up security. But I need all of you to stay vigilant. If you see or hear anything suspicious, report it immediately." The staff murmured their agreement, though the unease was palpable. That night, Miles couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he drove home, he kept glancing in his rearview mirror, certain a dark SUV was following him. He tried to dismiss the thought, telling himself it was just paranoia. But when he pulled into his driveway and saw the same SUV idling at the corner of his street, his suspicions hardened. Miles parked his car and stepped out, his heart pounding as he pretended not to notice the vehicle. The SUV's engine rumbled, and it slowly pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. Miles stood there for a moment, his chest tightening. This was more than a coincidence. Inside his house, he locked the doors and called Dan. "I think Thornton's having me followed," Miles said. Dan cursed under his breath. "That's not surprising, but it's bad news. If he's sending people to tail you, he's probably planning something bigger. You need to be careful." "I can handle myself," Miles said, "but I need to make sure the restaurant and my staff are safe." "I'll get some people on it," Dan replied. "In the meantime, don't go anywhere alone. Thornton's cornered, and a cornered man is dangerous." The next day, Miles arrived at the restaurant to find a police car parked out front. The officer inside introduced himself as Detective Ramirez, a plain-spoken man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I've been assigned to your case," Ramirez said. "The threats, the vandalism. It's all linked to Thornton, right?" Miles nodded. "I believe so. And now I'm being followed. Thornton won't stop until he gets what he wants." Ramirez's expression darkened. "We're investigating, but you need to understand something. Thornton has resources. If he's connected to organized crime, this could escalate fast. You need to be ready for anything." Miles clenched his fists. "I appreciate your help, Detective, but I'm not backing down." As the day went on, Miles tried to focus on the restaurant, but the tension was inescapable. That evening, as the last customers were leaving, James approached him with a concerned look. "Mr. Carter," James said quietly, "there's a guy sitting at the bar who's been here for hours. He's not eating or drinking much, just watching. It's unsettling." Miles nodded. "I'll handle it." He walked to the bar, where a burly man in a leather jacket sat nursing a half-empty beer. The man looked up as Miles approached, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" Miles asked. The man smirked. "Just enjoying the atmosphere. Nice place you've got here." Miles's gut told him this wasn't a casual visit. "If you're not ordering, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We're closing soon." The man stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Sure thing, boss. But if I were you, I'd keep an eye out. You never know who might walk through that door next." Miles's chest tightened, but he refused to show fear. "Is that a threat?" The man chuckled. "Just friendly advice." As he walked out, Miles caught a glimpse of a tattoo on the man's wrist, a symbol he didn't recognize but suspected wasn't harmless. He turned to James. "Get everyone out. Now." James didn't hesitate, rounding up the staff and sending them home. Once the restaurant was empty, Miles locked the doors and called Ramirez. "I just had a guy in here who didn't belong," Miles said. "He left, but something's not right. He said I should keep an eye out." Ramirez's voice was tense. "Get home. I'll send a patrol to watch the place tonight. And Miles, don't take any chances. Thornton's desperate, and desperate men do stupid things." As Miles left the restaurant, the dark SUV reappeared, trailing him all the way home. This time, Miles was sure Thornton's people were watching his every move. And whatever they were planning, it was coming soon. Miles sat in the darkened living room of his apartment, watching the shadows shift outside the window. He had locked every door, drawn every curtain, and checked every corner of his home twice. The tension in his chest hadn't eased since the moment he noticed the dark SUV following him home. The text messages, the threats, the vandalism, it all pointed to one thing. Thornton was escalating, and Miles knew the man wasn't going to stop until he had the upper hand. Miles's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. He picked it up, his stomach dropping when he saw it was an unknown number again. "Tick-tock, Carter. Time's almost up." He stared at the message, his pulse quickening. The threat was vague but chilling, a reminder that the clock was ticking on something sinister. The next morning, Miles arrived at the restaurant to find Ramirez waiting for him. The detective's expression was grim as he motioned for Miles to step outside. "We got a lead on the guy who was here last night," Ramirez said. "The description your staff gave matches a known associate of Thornton's. He's got a record: intimidation, assault, even a few extortion charges. Do you think Thornton sent him?" Miles asked. Ramirez nodded. "I'd bet on it. But proving it is another matter. Thornton's smart. He won't leave a paper trail. We'll keep an eye on him, but you need to stay alert. This guy is bad news." Miles's jaw tightened. "Thanks, detective. I'll let you know if I see anything suspicious." That evening, the restaurant was unusually quiet. News of the threats had spread, and some regular customers were staying away. Miles understood their fear, but it hurt to see the empty tables. As the night wore on, James approached Miles with a worried look. "Mr. Carter, there's something you need to see." He led Miles to the back alley behind the restaurant, where a package sat ominously near the door. It was a plain cardboard box, no markings or labels, and it didn't look like a normal delivery. Miles's stomach churned. "Don't touch it. Call the police." Within minutes, Ramirez and a bomb squad arrived, cordoning off the area and carefully examining the package. Miles and his staff watched anxiously from a safe distance. After what felt like hours, the squad confirmed it wasn't an explosive. Instead, the box contained a chilling message: a single black feather and a note that read, "This is your final warning." Ramirez approached Miles, his face hard. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. They're trying to break you." Miles's chest tightened. He thought of his staff, his customers, and everything he had built. "They're not going to break me," he said firmly. The next day, Miles and Clara met with Dan to go over the latest developments. Dan had uncovered more connections between Thornton and the security firm, including payments made just days before the threats began. "It's clear Thornton's orchestrating this," Dan said. "The problem is, he's covering his tracks well. We need more than circumstantial evidence to bring him down." Clara frowned. "What about the offshore accounts? If we can tie those to the payments?" Dan shook his head. "We're working on it, but it's slow going. Thornton's got layers of protection. He knows how to play the game." Miles leaned forward. "What about the guy from last night? The one Ramirez mentioned?" Dan nodded. "I've been digging into him too. His name's Leon Brooks. He's a known enforcer for hire, and he's been seen with Thornton's people before. If we can connect him to the threats, it could blow this wide open." Miles exhaled sharply. "Then we need to keep pushing. Thornton's not going to stop, so we can't either." That evening, as Miles locked up the restaurant, the SUV appeared again. This time, it didn't linger. Instead, it rolled up slowly, and the passenger window lowered just enough for Miles to see a man in a hoodie staring at him. "Nice place you've got here," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "Shame if something happened to it." Miles's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Is that a threat?" The man chuckled. "Just a friendly observation." Before Miles could respond, the SUV sped off, leaving him standing in the quiet street. The next morning, Miles received a call from Ramirez. "We've been monitoring Thornton's associate, Brooks," the detective said. "He met with Thornton last night at a private club. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." Miles's stomach sank. "Do you think they're going to target the restaurant again?" "It's possible," Ramirez said. "Or it could be something worse. We'll have officers patrolling the area, but you need to be ready for anything." Miles thanked him and hung up, his mind racing. He called an emergency meeting with his staff, explaining the situation and urging them to be cautious. As the day wore on, the restaurant buzzed with nervous energy. Miles stayed in his office, reviewing security footage and double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. Just as he was starting to feel a sliver of hope, Clara burst into the office, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. Miles took the phone and saw a video that had just been posted online. It showed the restaurant's exterior at night, with the words "coming soon" spray-painted across the front windows. The video ended with a close-up of the spray can and a distorted voice saying, "Time's up, Carter." Miles set the phone down, his hands trembling. Whatever Thornton was planning, it was no longer a matter of if, it was when, and Miles had no intention of waiting to find out. The video was everywhere within hours. News outlets, social media platforms, even local TV stations were broadcasting it. The words "coming soon" scrawled across the front windows of Carter's, paired with the ominous message, "Time's up, Carter," sent waves of panic through the city. Miles watched the footage on his phone as his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. Thornton was escalating into something more dangerous. Clara, standing beside him, broke the silence. "We need to act now. Thornton's making his move." Miles nodded, his mind racing. "I'm not waiting around for him to show up. We're taking this to the next level. Call the press. Make sure they know Thornton's behind this. I want the public to see that he's willing to destroy everything just to win." Clara hesitated. "I get it, but we're walking a fine line here. Thornton's going to come after us harder if we expose too much." "I'm done playing by his rules," Miles said firmly. "He's already proven he'll stop at nothing to destroy me. I won't back down now." Clara didn't argue. "Okay, I'll get the press release ready. We'll make sure it's clear that we're not intimidated, and we'll share everything we have on Thornton's illegal activities. Let's make sure the public knows he's the real threat here." As Clara worked on the release, Miles called Dan again. The investigator had been tirelessly working to dig up more dirt on Thornton's connections. "Dan, I need everything," Miles said urgently. "Whatever you've got on Thornton's associates, his criminal activities, everything. I don't care how deep it goes. We're going public with all of it." Dan's voice came through the phone, heavy with exhaustion. "I've got a lead on one of Thornton's offshore accounts. If we can tie that to his security firm, it could be enough to shut him down for good. But I need more time." Miles's patience was wearing thin, but he knew Dan was doing everything he could. "Take your time, but make it quick. Thornton's making his move, and we're running out of it." Later that evening, as the press release went live, the floodgates opened. Miles's statement hit the media like a bombshell. He outlined the threats, the vandalism, and the direct connections between Thornton's criminal activities and the intimidation campaign against Carter's. He refused to be bullied and made it clear that he would fight back against any attempts to harm his business, his employees, or himself. The public's response was overwhelming. People took to social media to show their support, and the hashtag #StopThornton began trending. There was no turning back now. Thornton's reputation was in tatters, and Miles was determined to finish what they had started. But in the back of his mind, Miles knew that Thornton wasn't going to go quietly. The next morning, the tension in the restaurant was palpable. Miles arrived early, walking through the empty dining room with a sense of foreboding hanging over him. The place had always been a sanctuary, a safe space where people could come together and enjoy a meal. But now, it felt like a battlefield. James met him in the hallway, his face tense. "Mr. Carter, there's something you need to see." Miles followed James to the back of the restaurant, where the staff had gathered around something unsettling. On the ground near the trash cans was a charred pile of what looked like paper and ash. As Miles stepped closer, he realized it was part of a document, scorched and torn. Only a few words were still legible. "I'll make you regret this." Miles's heart skipped a beat. Thornton was making his move. "We need to call the police," James said, his voice shaky. "No," Miles said, his voice firm. "This is Thornton. He's trying to provoke us. We won't give him the satisfaction of seeing us scared. This ends now." That evening, as the restaurant prepared to close, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The staff was on edge, constantly glancing toward the windows, watching for any sign of trouble. And then it happened. A loud crash rang out from the front of the restaurant, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Miles's heart raced as he ran toward the front doors, only to stop short when he saw what had happened. The glass door had been shattered, and standing in the doorway was a masked figure, holding a large, metal crowbar. "Carter!" the figure yelled, voice muffled by the mask. "This is the end of your little business." The staff screamed in panic, but Miles stood frozen, staring at the intruder. He had never felt such a surge of adrenaline in his life. This was it, the moment he had been expecting. The masked figure took a step forward, the crowbar raised menacingly. Miles's instincts kicked in. "Get back!" he shouted at his staff. "Run!" As the staff scrambled to escape through the back, Miles took a deep breath and rushed toward the intruder, his mind focused and clear. The figure swung the crowbar, but Miles ducked just in time, grabbing a chair and swinging it at the masked man. The chair connected with a loud crack, knocking the crowbar out of the intruder's hand. The figure staggered back, and Miles didn't hesitate. He tackled the intruder to the ground, pinning him down as the restaurant's security alarm blared in the background. "Who sent you?" Miles demanded, his voice cold. The masked figure struggled beneath him, but Miles held him firmly. "Tell me who sent you." There was no answer. The man simply thrashed, his eyes wild with anger and fear. Suddenly, a loud voice from outside called out, "Miles, let him go." Miles froze, glancing up to see Detective Ramirez standing in the doorway, gun drawn. "Let him go," Ramirez repeated. "We've got him now." With a reluctant sigh, Miles released the intruder, who was quickly cuffed by the officers standing behind Ramirez. The mask was pulled off, revealing the face of Leon Brooks, the same enforcer Miles had heard about, the one connected to Thornton's operation. "Thought you could take me down, huh?" Brooks sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "Thornton's never gonna let you win." "Thornton's done," Miles said, his voice unwavering. "This is over." But even as the words left his mouth, Miles knew the fight was far from finished. As the police led Brooks away, Miles stood in the middle of the restaurant, staring at the shattered door. He had won this battle, but he was certain that Thornton would find another way to strike. The war was far from over, and soon, the final confrontation would come. Miles could feel it in his bones. The question was, would he be ready when it did? The weeks following the confrontation at the restaurant were tense but hopeful. With Leon Brooks in custody and more evidence piling up, Miles's case against Thornton grew stronger. The media attention, while initially unsettling, had worked in their favor. Public opinion shifted drastically against Thornton, with many calling for justice and accountability for his actions. Thornton's empire began to crumble as more details about his criminal activities were revealed. His illegal business practices, shady connections, and the intimidation tactics he'd used to maintain control. Law enforcement dug deeper into his finances, freezing several accounts, and within a matter of days, Thornton's name was associated with a series of scandals that tarnished his reputation beyond repair. As for Miles, the aftermath of the battle brought both relief and exhaustion. He could finally breathe a little easier knowing that his business, his team, and his future were secure. The constant threats and intimidation were behind him, and although there was still work to be done to rebuild and heal from the ordeal, he had emerged victorious. One evening, Miles stood in the restaurant, looking out over the tables that were filled with smiling customers once again. The walls of Carter's were scarred, but they were standing strong, just like the people who worked there. The past few months had tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated, but they had also revealed the true power of unity, courage, and standing up for what's right. James, now more confident and at ease than ever, approached Miles with a smile. "It feels like things are finally back to normal." Miles nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "It does. We've come a long way, James. This place, it's more than just a restaurant. It's a symbol of everything we stand for." James's smile widened. "And I'm proud to be part of it." That evening, as the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Miles sat down at the bar with Clara, who had been by his side every step of the way. "We did it," Miles said, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of everything that had happened was finally starting to settle. Clara raised her glass, her expression warm but serious. "We did. But you did the hard part, Miles. You stood up when everyone else would have folded. You protected what mattered most." Miles clinked his glass with hers. "We all did. We couldn't have done it without each other." As they sat in the quiet of the restaurant, the sound of the city outside almost soothing in its normalcy, Miles felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight had been long, and at times, it had seemed impossible. But now, it was over. Thornton was behind bars, and the future was wide open. And for the first time in months, Miles Carter could finally let himself believe that everything he had worked for, the restaurant, the team, his integrity, was safe.